As I mentioned last week, just as a note really, is that if your Bibles read King Xerxes in the text of Esther, that's not a mistake. They're the same person. Xerxes is the Greek name. Ahasuerus is his Hebrew name given in the Hebrew manuscripts. So they're the same person. I'm not reading from a different text if you have Xerxes in your passage. Now, I want us to think carefully about these words from Jesus. If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Now, for a number of us, we find these words of Jesus quite jarring because they reveal that there are some people in this world who have no time or tolerance for Christians or the Christian church. They hate it and they want it gone. Esther chapter 3, which we're looking at this morning, is one historic manifestation of this age-old truth. People of the church, whether in the Old Testament or the New, face quite a bit of hateful hostility at times. So this morning we're going to be thinking about where does this hostility come from? How unrestrained hostility is often expressed, and what hope can the church have when even vast political resources of a hostile nation are turned against them? These are big questions. These are serious questions. So let's get straight to them. As we read Esther chapter 3, we're not exactly sure how much time passed between chapter 2 and chapter 3. In chapter 2, Mordecai saves the king's life by exposing an assassination plot. And by chapter 3, it seems that the political situation had deteriorated quite significantly. Dark times had come upon the Old Testament church, as it's summarized in verse 6. Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, that is the church of the Old Testament, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. The political tide had turned against the church significantly. But to make proper sense of the situation here in Esther, we have to pay attention to the clues given to us in the text, which tells us of a much older hostility taking place between the people of Haman and the people of Mordecai, that is the church of the Old Testament. The roots of Haman's hostility are hundreds of years deep. We see this in verse 1. Haman is introduced to us in this chapter as Haman the Agagite. That's deliberate. That's deliberately there in the text. To be an Agagite is to be known as a descendant of King Agag, whose tribe, the Amalekites, had long been enemies of the Old Testament church. In the time of the Exodus, this is the second book of the Bible, in the time of the Exodus, when Israel had made her long and very difficult journey of freedom from Egyptian slavery, it was the Amalekites who came and fought with Israel in her desert wanderings. Moses recalls this situation like this. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail those who were lagging behind you. And he did not fear God. This kind of animosity between the Amalekites and the Old Testament church flames up in the Old Testament. And you can read about this in places like 1 Samuel chapter 15. It's sort of just flashpoints come between Israel and the Amalekites. But the point is this: the Amalekites, from whom Haman was descended, had an ancient feud against the Old Testament church. So whoever recorded these events of Esther for us, they want us to note this. They want us to keep in mind this ancient hostility when he introduced Haman as the descendant of Agag, as Haman the Agagite. He wants you to tap the old story that is there in the Old Testament. And this is true for Esther and Mordecai as it is for the church today. Hostility projected against the church has ancient origins. This is not a new phenomenon of the modern world. It is ancient. It has old roots. As surely as Cain murdered Abel, the unbelieving world has always been at odds with the believing church. But it's very hard for us in the Western world to get our heads around this. We don't believe this. We don't believe that there is some kind of hostility taking shape against the church. And consequently, we've grown skeptical that the church does have real enemies, that the church is even exposed to real hatred in the world. But as one Catholic academic pointed out, persecution focuses the mind on the fact that the kingdom of this world is an enemy to the kingdom of God. When there hasn't been any persecution for a long time, as in our part of the world, many Christians start expecting the world to be a friend. They slip into seeking the world's approval instead of God's. And therein is the challenge for us, isn't it? For a number of generations, we've had it so good in the West. Could it be that season of ease that we have grown unprepared and unwilling to face more hostile seasons? Seasons when the church's true loyalties will be tested. And that's the question for us, isn't it? It's a question of loyalty. Who will you be loyal to when the hard times come? Loyalty is perhaps the question which sparks the fire of Haman's hatred towards Mordecai and the church of the Old Testament. We note this in verse 2. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. This is Mordecai, what he's doing here. This is not a religious thing. To bow down to Haman was not some kind of emperor worship or state worship. It was simply a signal of respect or honor. When I was in intermediate school, one of the school rules was to stand with your back against the corridor when teachers walked past. And Georgette and Derek will laugh at this because they will remember a terrified 10, 11 and 12-year-olds clutching that wall as if their life depended on it. But we did it, didn't we, as students? It was a sign of respect for our teachers. And this is what Mordecai refused to give Haman. And as we noted, this is unlikely to be just a mere scruple between Mordecai and Haman. It's not just some personal dispute between these two men. It's not just chest thumping between two guys that can't get along. No, the hostility here and the refusal of Mordecai to pay respect to Haman has a much deeper origin. It stems from an historical hostility, old baggage between the people of God and the descendants of the Amalekites. In other words, Mordecai's refusal to honor Haman embodies, in a moment, it embodies and it typifies the refusal of Israel, the Old Testament church, to respectfully bow to her enemies who sought her destruction. It is a crystallization of an ancient feud here. It is the display of an ancient hostility here, that Israel would not bow down to her enemies, nor would Mordecai. As it is, by not bowing down to Haman, Mordecai stood out like a sore thumb, didn't he? Everyone's bowing down to Haman, but Mordecai. He refused to go along with the cultural expectations of his day. And his reason seems to be biblically grounded. The reason he wanted to stick out seems to be biblically grounded. Indeed, after all his colleagues applied pressure and told Mordecai to fit in and to conform to this expectation of bowing down to the state official, verse 4 says, Mordecai would not bow down, for he had told them that he was a Jew. In this statement, Mordecai is signaling to one and all his loyalty to God as a member of the Old Testament church. He is not here simply signifying his ethnic identity. He is here identifying his spiritual identity. He is an active part of the Old Testament church. He is part of the believing community. Then this reveals his true loyalty, doesn't it? And this loyalty to God is the one loyalty that trumps all other loyalties, including political loyalties. And this was completely intolerable to Haman. If Mordecai won't fit in, if Mordecai won't conform and show loyalty to Haman, and as Haman now suspects, none of the Old Testament church would, they must all die. If Mordecai won't bow the knee, that means the whole church is not going to bow the knee. And if that's the case, they must all die. There cannot be any rivals in Haman's mind. It will be him that is bowed down to and honored and respected, and if not, everyone else who does not respect him must die. And as you read this story, you have to ask yourself, don't you, isn't killing the entire people group a bit of an overreaction? It's only Mordecai that we know of at this point that is not bowing down, and Haman goes into a rage and says all his people has to die. Not just Mordecai, not just his family, anyone associated with Mordecai has to die. Men, women, children, everyone has to go. You think that's a bit disproportionate, don't you? That's quite sick, isn't it? To go out at people so extensively. We might even say that it is quite irrational to behave this way. And perhaps it is. But this is the nature of unbelief. It easily slides into irrationality. The Apostle Paul makes this point in Romans chapter 1. He opens up and he says to us, since they, that is the unbeliever, did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. According to Romans, unbelief leads to a debased mind, which dreams up all kinds of evil including murder. And we recognize this in Haman, don't we? He is the unbelieving man in the story. And because he is an unbelieving man that refuses to acknowledge God, he goes down all kinds of irrational avenues, including that of mass murder. Haman acts irrationally because Haman does not acknowledge God. The lesson for us is somewhat sobering. In times when our loyalties are being tested, when our profession of faith is being stress tested to see if it's fit for purpose, we must budget for the fact that the unbelieving mind can and will indulge murderous thoughts against those who belong to the church. Just recently we've seen an example of this after the stabbing of the famed author Salman Rushdie, the Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling, who publicly, interestingly enough, identifies as a Christian, received this threat. Don't worry, you're next. Right? There is this murderous hostility simmering away. I'm not saying that every unbeliever wants to see you dead. Don't misunderstand me. Not every unbeliever wants to see Christians dead. Not at all. God restrains, graciously so, a great deal of evil in this lost and broken world. But I do want to disabuse us of our Western naivety that maintaining a credible profession of faith can be done without ever encountering hostility from an unbelieving world. You must disabuse yourself of that naivety. To have a credible profession of faith as a Christian in the world will at times mean facing hostility from the unbelieving world. Indeed, as you know, for many Christians in hostile nations, hostility often boils over into murder, just as the hostility from Haman boiled over to the intention of wanting to murder the entire Old Testament church. Now, there are a couple of other things that we can also identify in the text. We can also identify how Haman sought to foment his personal hostility against the church in the public space and then shape public opinion against the church. This is a run-of-the-mill tactic. If you have public influence and you hate the church, you're going to try and persuade the public to do so also. You're going to want to shape public opinion against your enemy. Let's think about this looking at verse 8. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them." This is a very carefully planned propaganda piece from Haman. Remember, he's second in command, but he still needs Xerxes' or Ahasuerus' approval to carry out mass murder. And what better way than to shape or sculpt public opinion, that is to propagandize the populace, than to begin with an element of truth? How are you going to persuade people to get on board with this plan unless you have a winning argument, unless it seems like you're making sense? Indeed, Haman does start with the truth. He does start with an element of truth in his play for shaping the public opinion. He says, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom." That's true. Remember, Xerxes' empire was 127 provinces big. It stretched from India to northern Sudan. It was massive. It was the known world of the day. It was the global superpower. And within that superpower, it did in fact absorb nations within its boundaries. This much is true. Haman is right. There are a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples of Xerxes' kingdom. But the suggestion here is that one particular group who had been swallowed up by the great Xerxes, that is, the people of God, they're not assimilating. They're not letting go of their religious identity. They're not adopting the ways of the empire. Haman's suggestion to Xerxes is this: these God people are among us, but they are not like us. And that's going to be a problem. The suggestion here, of course, that the church is there to cause trouble is followed up by a more damning suspicion. Haman says their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws. This also is somewhat true. The Old Testament church did in fact have a moral code and religious practices that were out of step with the empire. But what's damning here is Haman insinuating that the moral code of the Old Testament church, their system of ethics, their doctrines, their way of life, is a danger to the empire. And I think this is where we find ourselves more and more these days, isn't it? A number of political players know the Christian church has its own moral code, a system of ethics and doctrines that are out of step with the ambitions of a secular state. Christian views on abortion, assisted suicide, marriage, family, and sexuality are perhaps the most noted examples in our day. But there is a creeping narrative that Christians who hold loyal to biblical views are harmful to society. They are a danger to society. And we know this, don't we? Think about recently how Bethlehem College was brutally treated in the media for days on end for a simple statement in their curriculum that holds the view that marriage is between a man and a woman. They were slaughtered for days on end in the media as being very dangerous people. That their doctrinal view will make people suicidal. That their view on marriage was in fact not within the keeping of the law of New Zealand. Haman was spinning a similar narrative to shape a negative public perception of the Old Testament church. He was putting it to the king. Within your empire, O king, are God's people who have views and doctrines which are disagreeable to your laws, O king. And having come this far and trying to shape public perception against God's people, Haman goes all in with an outright lie. He's come this far to shaping public opinion. Now the hammer comes down. It is not in the king's profit to tolerate them. You see in the space of a verse how quickly you've gone from Xerxes, there's people in your empire who do not hold the views that you do, to Xerxes, these people, they all have to die. Right? the pendulum has swung very quickly here. Hostility came upon the church very quickly here. And besides, this assertion that God's people bring no benefit or obedience to the empire doesn't even add up. The facts of the matter don't even stack up. I mean, think about this. Are people like Esther and Mordecai really that disobedient or detrimental to Xerxes' empire? When Esther, as a young girl, was commanded to come and live in the king's harem, she did so without any trouble to the empire. Mordecai himself even saved the king's life by exposing an assassination plot. From the little we know that God's people were good citizens to that empire, even though they did not subscribe to all the king's laws, edicts, and ideology. Now, true as that may be, this chapter doesn't offer us a lot in terms of defending God's people in hostile times. This is merely setting the stage for us. Why did this happen? What is this ancient hostility brewing between the unbelieving world and the believing church? So this chapter is really more about Haman, his wounded ego because Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him, and the resulting propaganda against the Old Testament church. Haman wants vengeance because Mordecai, and by implication the whole church, would not demonstrate an absolute loyalty to the state official Haman. So, I know this sermon and this chapter is a bit of a spiral into the darkness of the hostility facing the Old Testament church. It's not a pleasant situation facing them. But at the same time, we are to learn from this should we ever face similar times of hostility. Esther is there for us to learn from, to prepare ourselves if we are ever to face more hostile times as a Christian church. And one of the things we are learning here is how the unregenerate heart spoils for a fight with God. And if they can't fight God, they'll certainly fight his church. Why? Because they hold differing and often opposing points of view. As the great Anglican minister John Stott once noted, persecution is simply the clash between two irreconcilable value systems. Persecution is simply the clash between two irreconcilable value systems. It is my contention then that Esther is one of those remarkably helpful parts of Christian scripture which not only accounts for the hostility the church faced in history, but also prepares the contemporary Christians like you and I for times of hostility which may yet come our way. We don't know if they will or not. They may. But a book like Esther helps us prepare. So let's not be dismissive of thinking that hostility could never break out against the Christian church in the West today. We have to think closely again on the abiding reality of Jesus' own words. If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. And this is where I'd like to close then. Jesus said, the world hated me before it hated you. The question is why? Why did the world hate Jesus? Jesus was hated because he came like light into a dark world, And that dark world did not want to adjust her eyes to the light. As we're told elsewhere, speaking of Jesus, the light has come into the world, and the people loved the darkness rather than the light because their deeds were evil. They didn't want to adjust their eyes to the light that had come in amongst them. And this is the default setting of every human heart. And this is what Jesus must fix if we are to love him and receive him at all. For this reason, Jesus came into the world. He was the light that shined in the darkness of human nature. And the darkness rejected him and crucified him. But the darkness could not hold him in his grave, nor prevent God from raising him from the dead. No, the darkness of sin took a death blow at the empty grave. Because the empty grave signaled that atonement had been made, sin had been forgiven, Christ has triumphed, and now bids all people into the kingdom and family of his church. To all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become the children of God.